Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In our previous video, we have discussed about the integration service, which is LogicApp. We have discussed what is LogicApp, how it works, and we did a quick round of comparison between the XSTR of the LogicApp. Today in this video, we'll discuss about how do we create a LogicApp or the different type of LogicApp in Azure portal, and we'll go through the different sections of the LogicApp in the Azure portal itself. Hi, this is Rakesh Suryavanshi and you're watching Be a Learner. Let's get started. So I've already logged into Azure portal with my Azure account, and now if you click here on the create new resource, or if you can also type in the LogicApp here in the search box to search any existing LogicApp resource which you might have in your Azure subscription, or you want to create a new LogicApp right here from this particular section. Let's create a new LogicApp by typing LogicApps icon. So here you can see that the plan type is LogicApp. There is no option, a bit confusing as we have the plan is in LogicApp. Let's click on the create button. This is where you have the option to choose this Azure subscription or resource group, in case if you would like to create a LogicApp into a new resource group, or if you don't want, you want to use an existing resource group, you can select the existing resource group or choosing your LogicApp. Here you have to provide a LogicApp name. It has to be unique. For example, if I provide the name as LogicApp 01, it says the LogicApp is not available. What does it mean? That the LogicApp itself is a platform as a service. So this LogicApp name which you are defining, it has to be unique across the globe. It is the same concept as we use while defining the services like storage account, app service, and other platform as a service which are globally unique. So it has to be globally unique. And if you look at carefully, the name which I'm defining for my LogicApp resource type, it is appending with the subdomain of the Azure, which is .azurewebsite.net. So whatever is your LogicApp name, let's say here in this case I'm going to give a demo 01, then my LogicApp name is going to be 01, which can be accessible LogicApp lab-demo-01, which can be accessed over the internet with the help of lab-demo01.azurewebsite.net, which is the subdomain for the app service. So it's using the same subdomain what we have for the app service plans like Azure Function or the web apps. So there is no difference in that. Then in the publish section, you can have a LogicApp option to define either in the as in form of the workflow standalone, or you can define the LogicApp into the Docker container as well. For now, we are going to keep the default option, which is workflow as is. Next, you have the reason which you can choose to define your LogicApp. So depending upon the type of reason here you want to choose your LogicApp, you can choose that. So I'm going to choose the West Euro for creating this particular LogicApp section. Next, you have the plan type which you can define to create your LogicApp. As we discussed in our previous video, there are two different type of plans or the XSTR available with the LogicApp. One is the standard and the consumption tier, and that's the reason you have the radio button option available. By default, you can see that the standard is selected, but if you want, you can go for the pay-as-you-go model, which is your consumption-based model. Now, if you look at the behavior of the plan type, at the moment when the standard plan is selected, it's giving you the option to define your LogicApp within the app service plan. It is the same as when you create the app service plan or the Azure function. When you create the standard type of the Azure function or app service, you have the option to create those resources in the app service plan. Similarly, the standard LogicApps, something which you can create under the app service plans as well. So if I choose the consumption based plan, then you can see that that option is not nowhere available, but you do have the options such as the zero redundant, which you can enable and disable based on your need. I already have created the consumption based logic app, which I'll show you in a moment. So I'm not going to choose the consumption based for this particular demonstration. I'll stick to the standard based logic app, and here you have the option to rename your app service plan. So by default it is giving you a unique app service plan name based on the logic app name which you have given. But if you have option to basically change this particular configuration, and at the same time you can define the SKU size of the app service plan. Why the app service and the at the same time you can define the SKU for your app service plan. Now, if what does it means here is the logic apps which you are using, it will run under the capacity or the configuration of the app service plan. So the higher power of the app service plan you choose, you have the more performance benefit for your logic app to run under. And it is also possible that a single app services plan can serve to the multiple logic apps. So that is the reason it's giving me a drop down. So if I would have the multiple app service plan, then I could have chosen the existing app service plan to define my logic app. Okay, here you can change the size of the logic app. So if I am planning to, let's say, deploy my logic apps into a production environment, then I could go for the production based app service plan which are given here, which has obviously it would have the different capacities or capabilities based on the configuration you choose. Also, you do have the option to choose a dedicated isolated networking scale, which is an app service using the app service environment, which is also known as an integrated service environment. So at the moment, I'll keep the configuration as is. Next, you have the next button for configuring the hosting option, which you may not have if you go for the consumption based plan. So let's recheck the consumption based, and if you look at the button now, it is switch or flip to the tags option. There is no hosting configuration available if you look at carefully here. And whereas if I switch back to the standard, I do have option to define the hosting. As we are going to create our logic app as a standard with the app service plan, then you have to define the storage associated with the app service plan and the logic app. And that's the reason you have to define what would be your hosting of what would be your hosting storage for the logic app, what these hosting storage are going to be used. So any workflow runs or workflow data or any information about the logic app which it requires to store, it will store onto this particular type of storage. For by default, the option you have is the storage account, but you do have the option to change it from storage account to the Azure SQL Server as well, which is in preview right now. So I'll stick to the default option, which is storage account. This means that it will require, or it would create a new storage account which it will be using to store or to log the data of my logic app runs. Also at the same time, I can use an existing storage account as well. So same storage account can be shared here in this case as well. Next, you can define the monitoring as well. So as we are using the standard logic app configuration like the app service, so you do have option to set up the application insight monitoring section, which you may opt or maybe disable it. I can, here in this case, I'm disabling it. In some future videos, we'll see how do you configure the monitoring section for the logic app. Next, you have the standard tags which you may want to define for your resources for the billing purpose. And then once it is done, you can click on create and review, and that will create a resource, a logic app resource in your subscription. I'll click on create here, and that will take a moment or so to create the logic app in my subscription. Meanwhile, I'll go to the resource section where I have already created a consumption based logic app, which I'll give you walkthrough of the dashboard of that particular logic app. So I'm just opening a designer of the logic app. So here is the logic app which we have created for this demonstration, consumption based logic app which we have created in the ECS location. Currently, if you can see that it has the dashboard, where you can find all the information such as which resource group this logic is deployed into, and then the location, subscription, and then how many number of triggers or actions it contains in a particular definition. The reason you get this information here at the dashboard, because the consumption based logic app can have only single workflow, like I mentioned in my previous demonstration, in my previous video. So all the triggers and actions, you can get the count here. The status of the logic app, as you can see, it is currently enabled. You can also disable it if you would like to disable it. And then it says the history of the number of runs in last 24 hours, how many of them are succeeded, how many of them are failed. And also at the same time, you can see the run history or the trigger history at this particular volumetric or the historical section here at the dashboard itself. Now, we do have some other connections. For example, you have the app logic app designer, where you define your workflow or you design your workflow. If I click here on the workflow, you can basically use either of these built-in triggers, or you can define or start writing your own template using the blank template and define your own workflow as you have the requirement to define. You can also go and start developing your logic app as in the code view, or the other way around. As soon as you define it as in designer flow, it generates the XML based or the JSON based code view, which you can look at here. Now, this is where we have the API connection. So if your logic apps are using different actions, and if those actions are required to use the different manage or built-in connectors, then those connector needs to have the connection created with the help of API connections. All those API connection lists can be available here with this particular logic app section or the API connection section. Next, you have the standard workflow settings which you can use or define, which will give you the different configurations such as the allowed inbound IP addresses, which you may want to restrict if you would like to integrate with any kind of integration account, which we do not have at the moment. But if you would have the integration account created, then you can integrate your logic app with the integration account. You can add authorization policies if you wish to. Then also you have the access policies can be generated for the logic app in case if you would like to, let's say, connect to this logic app as an HTTP call. So it might possible that you might want to use the these generated keys to basically connect to the logic app workflows. Next, you have the manage identity. With the logic app, it is possible that you can set up the system assigned or the user defined identity setup with your logic apps. Here you have the properties section where you can get the configurations such as the access point, resource ID, outbound, inbound, or IP addresses, and other resources which you may want to configure. And then next you have the monitoring standard configuration, which you will find in any other Azure resources. As we have the resource or our standard logic app is created, so let's look at the different sections available for the standard logic app configuration. Now, the difference between the standard and the consumption based logic app is we have the ability to create multiple workflows here. So that's the reason, that is the reason you do not see the workflow history here or here at the dashboard for the standard case. So the information available we have is resource group, status, location, and then what operating system this particular logic app is based out of. Next you have, which is Windows at the moment. Windows is only supported, and then you have the you have the Docker based system. Then you have your URL for your logic app, and then next you have the app service plan in which your logic app is being configured. Okay, now you do have a different dedicated section available for the standard type of logic app which was not available with the consumption based logic app. So as we discussed earlier as well, with the standard based logic app you do have the opportunity to create more than one workflow within a logic app, and this workflow will share or it will be under the umbrella of the same logic app, and it will share the same it can share the same resources, such as it can share the connections, parameters, or even the app configuration can be shared by the different workflow. So that is what the good thing we have available with the standard type of logic app. If I click on the standard on the workflow, then you do have the option to create add new workflow, and obviously when we click on add new workflow, it will ask you which type of workflow you want to create. Is it a stateless workflow, or it's going to be a stateful workflow? It's up to the choice of workflow you want to create. We'll go into the detail of the workflow in our next video, but for now let's just focus on the area of the overall dashboard of the standard, or the overall dashboard of the logic app. Next you have the API connection, which is called as the connection. Here it will list down all the service provider connection, API connection, any function connection. So this is a different categories which are been given here, and overall JSON representation of those connection can be viewed here in the JSON form. So like we have a workflow converted into a JSON, similarly those connection which we are defining in your workflow will be available as in JSON as well, right? Next you have the parameters configuration. So with the logic app standard, you do have the option to define the reusable parameters which can be used across the different workflows. As I said, you can share those parameters if you want to, or you can create a dedicated parameter for the individual workflows. But this is a shared section, you don't have multiple. Like in workflow section, you have the option to define multiple workflow. Here at the API connection in the parameter section, you don't have option to create multiple different section of parameter. Yes, you can define multiple parameter, but it will be defined as in single scope, and it will be available to all the workflows. I hope it makes sense. Next you have the schemas. So if your integration logic, or if your logic app workflow requires to do some kind of a processing or the validation against the specific type of schemas, those schemas can be uploaded here as an artifact under the schema section. At the same time, if we have a requirement to map your logic app processing messages from source system to the destination system using some kind of a mapping logic, which can be defined as in Shopify liquid maps or the XSLT maps. So those kind of a map, basically you can upload it here, and these maps are something which can be used as the inside the workflow, as we do use the app connection or the parameters. We'll look into the details of these sections when we go to the practical session while creating the workflow, different type of workflows. Now, one of the interesting thing what we have with the standard type of logic app is the configuration. So like any app service or Azure function type of resources, we have the application configuration. Similarly for the logic app also, we do get the application configuration. So any variables, let's say you want to define, or which you may want to read it in your workflow. For example, I would like to read, let's say, database connection string from the key vault. So I can define a variable as in the connection string here in the configuration section, which can read the connection string from the key vault, and that particular value can be referred here in the workflow, or any constant or variables which you want to define and can be used, or you wanted to use by your workflows, that can be defined here in the configuration section. Next, if you look at here in the configuration as in a standard configuration section, this is a standard configuration section. What do we have for the other app services type? So you do have the workflow runtime configuration, which is currently turned off, but if I turn on, then you have the option to basically create the runtime scalable configuration as well. Next, you have some of the general settings which you may want to change in case if you want to. For example, currently the LogicApp stack, the technology stack which what it is using is Node.js version 14. If you want, you can change that. Currently, it is using a platform 32-bit platform. If you do have option two options, 32-bit and 64-bit, which you can change it if you want to. Pipeline, managed pipeline version is the integrated one, which you can choose if you want to. And then you have the FTP state. FTPS is allowed by default, and there are some HTTP version available, which you can change it to HTTP 1 to HTTP 2, which is recommended nowadays. And then there are some other standard configuration which is available. Next, you have the standard manage identity configuration which you can create. So currently the manage identity is enabled when I created the standard type of LogicApp by default, but if you want, you can turn it off, or you can attach and user defined system identity for the LogicApps. Okay, now you do also have some of the other options. For example, you can attach a custom domain to your LogicApp like you do for your app services or the function app. You can attach or networking configurations with your LogicApp. All these configurations are basically the configuration of app service plan, which you can define it within your LogicApp. You can scale, you can set up a horizontal scaling or vertical scaling with your LogicApp in case if you would like to do some kind of configuration. And then you have the access or control to the app service plan, which you may want to configure right here from the dashboard. I hope this overview of the quick comparison from the quick comparison of the LogicApp standard versus the consumption based LogicApp from the Azure portal gives some idea about the LogicApp, different type of LogicApp, and how the LogicApps are available in the Azure portal. It will give some idea. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. In the next video, I'll be creating some of the workflow, a very basic workflow which we'll be creating with our standard LogicApp, and we'll see how do you use this standard LogicApp workflow, or how do you use the workflow in general with your LogicApp workflows with your LogicApp. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video. Bye.